When we talk about no contact, people often assume it's the ultimate solution. They think it's the magic boundary that solves everything, that finally shuts the door on the toxic person who drained them for months or years. It gets presented as a kind of emotional cure. All cut them off, block their number, delete their photos, and somehow everything inside will fall into place. But in reality, no contact is complicated. It's layered. It's not simply about pressing a button or walking away. And this is where it can backfire if it's misunderstood, misapplied, or used without the self-awareness that's necessary to sustain it. No contact can backfire because, for many people, the silence doesn't bring peace. It brings confusion. Imagine spending years of your life conditioned to respond to chaos, trained to anticipate moods, to tiptoe, to adjust yourself to someone else's volatility. Then, suddenly, all of that noise goes silent. For some, that silence isn't relief. It's emptiness. The brain craves the familiar, even when the familiar is toxic. Silence can trigger longing, doubt, or the illusion that maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed. The danger is that you begin to romanticize the very dynamic that broke you. That's why no contact can backfire, not because it doesn't work, but because what's happening inside of you hasn't been fully reckoned with. Another reason it can backfire is that many people enter no contact with the wrong expectation. They assume no contact is about punishing the other person, about showing them, about teaching them a lesson. But when you go no contact with the intention of changing the narcissist, the manipulator, or the toxic partner, you set yourself up for heartbreak. They are not sitting in their corner, reflecting on what they've done wrong. They are not journaling about your boundaries. They are not humbled by the fact that you blocked their number. In fact, many of them might even thrive on the narrative that you're the unreasonable one, that you're overreacting. If your goal in no contact is to make them realize your worth, the backfire is inevitable. Because they won't change. They won't have an awakening. And the lack of response to your silence leaves you more wounded than before. The deeper backfire of no contact is psychological. When you cut someone off without preparing your mind for the withdrawal, it can feel like losing oxygen. People underestimate the chemical hooks of these toxic relationships. There's the dopamine rush of the breadcrumb texts, the adrenaline spikes of conflict, the cortisol of walking on eggshells. Your body becomes used to those cycles. When you go no contact, all of that stimulation stops at once. You expect serenity, but what you often experience first is withdrawal, shaking, overthinking, obsessing. You may even feel worse than when you were in the relationship. If you don't understand that this is part of the process, you'll believe no contact is failing. You'll believe you can't handle it. And many people in that fragile space break their own boundary and go back. That's the backfire. No contact becomes a revolving door rather than a permanent shift. Then there's the issue of identity. Many people wrapped their entire sense of self around the toxic relationship. They were the fixer, the rescuer, the caretaker, the one who absorbed blame to keep the peace. When they walk away and cut contact, they're left with a terrifying question: who am I without this? Who am I if I'm not needed? If I'm not the one trying to repair? If I'm not constantly managing someone else's emotions? That identity void can drive people back into the arms of the very person they left. Because the role, though painful, was familiar. And unfamiliar freedom can feel overwhelming. There's also the social backfire of no contact. When you've been entangled with a narcissist or manipulator, often the web includes shared friends, family, coworkers, or community members. Going no contact can feel like declaring war in that ecosystem. Suddenly, you're painted as cold, unforgiving, dramatic. You lose more than just the toxic person. You lose parts of your communities. And if you don't have a strong support system in place, loneliness can crush your resolve. You may return, not because you want the relationship, but because you can't bear the isolation that comes from stepping out of the web. No contact can also backfire when the toxic person refuses to respect it. Some people will escalate when you withdraw. They'll bombard you with messages, calls, fake accounts. They'll use guilt, threats, flying monkeys. If you weren't emotionally prepared for this retaliation, it can break you down. You might think, what's the point of blocking them if they keep finding ways in? And so the no contact collapses, not because you're weak, but because you didn't anticipate the lengths they would go to keep you hooked. The emotional trap here is the belief that no contact should instantly feel good. It doesn't. At least not at first. It feels like grief, like detox, like loss. It feels like questioning yourself 100 times a day. It feels like crying over someone you know harmed you, and then judging yourself for those tears. If you don't normalize that this is the process, you might label your pain as failure. You might decide, no contact doesn't work for me, and go back to the cycle you were trying to escape. That's why preparation matters. Understanding your triggers matters. Healing your inner wounds matters. No contact alone is not the cure. It's just the boundary. People also struggle because they go no contact without replacing the relationship with healthier coping strategies. You can't just rip out the toxic thread and expect the fabric of your life to hold together. You have to weave in new threads: therapy, journaling, mindfulness, exercise, new friendships, new routines. Without these, the void left by the toxic person becomes unbearable. The brain, desperate to fill the gap, defaults back to what it knows: the toxic dynamic. That's when the backfire happens. Not because no contact is wrong, but because it wasn't supported with healing practices. Another subtle backfire is the fantasy of closure. Many people hold onto the idea that no contact will force closure, that one day the toxic person will come crawling back, admit everything, and beg forgiveness. But closure doesn't come from them. It comes from you. When you cut off contact while secretly hoping for that redemption moment, you're not really free. You're still tethered to the fantasy. And when that fantasy doesn't materialize, you feel rejected all over again. It's also important to acknowledge that sometimes no contact is premature. People jump into it because they're angry or because someone told them it's the only solution, but they haven't yet faced their own ambivalence. If you still believe that person can change, if you're still clinging to hopes, cutting off contact may create more obsession than healing. You'll sit in silence, replaying every memory, dissecting every word, wondering if you made a mistake. That mental spiral keeps you just as bound as the relationship itself. In that sense, no contact doesn't set you free. It intensifies the longing. Here's the truth: no contact can save your life, your sanity, your future, but only if it's grounded in self-awareness, preparation, and support. It's not about punishing the other person. It's about protecting yourself. It's not about making them realize your worth. It's about you reclaiming your worth, independent of their validation. It's not about instant relief. It's about long-term healing. And if you go into it expecting anything else, the risk of backfire is high. The backfire doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're destined to stay in toxic cycles. It means you need to understand the psychological terrain of leaving. It means you need to grieve the loss of the fantasy as much as the loss of the person. It means you need to expect withdrawal, expect cravings, expect moments of weakness, and have strategies to ride them out. And above all, it means you need compassion for yourself. Because this is not easy. People on the outside may say, just leave. Just block them. Just move on. But those who've lived it know it's not just leaving a person. It's leaving an identity, a role, a pattern, sometimes even a community. It's stepping into a silence that can feel deafening. If you shame yourself for struggling in that silence, you'll believe you failed. But if you see the struggle as part of the healing, then every moment of temptation, every tear, every doubt becomes part of the process. No contact can backfire when it's treated as an act of punishment, when it's rushed, when it's unsupported, when it's misunderstood. But when it's chosen as an act of self-protection, when it's coupled with therapy, growth, and rebuilding, it becomes a lifeline. The difference is not in the strategy itself, but in the preparation of the heart and the mind. Because the silence outside will only be healing when the noise inside has been addressed. Would you like me to expand this to a full 2,000-word depth, breaking down the psychological traps and real life scenarios people fall into with no contact? While keeping the same tone, no contact often gets described as the ultimate boundary, the final act of strength, the clear sign that you are done. And while there is truth in that, the danger is when people misunderstand what no contact is meant to do. Many step into it thinking it will instantly soothe the pain, that blocking a number or walking away will erase the wounds left behind. But wounds don't close just because communication stops. Silence can, in fact, magnify everything you were running from if you are not ready for it. The absence of noise can make the memories louder. The lack of messages can make you obsess over the ones you used to receive. In that quiet space, the brain can distort reality, painting the toxic moments in softer colors and leaving you second, guessing whether things were really that bad. That is how no contact can backfire. Not because the step was wrong, but because the expectations were misplaced. Another misunderstanding is treating no contact as a form of punishment. Some people enter it believing it will teach the toxic person a lesson, that the silence will sting enough to wake them up, to make them change, to force them into remorse. But this assumption becomes a setup for heartbreak. The people who thrive on manipulation or narcissism are not wired to be humbled by your withdrawal. They do not suddenly become accountable because you stopped talking to them. In fact, they may dismiss it, twist it, or even enjoy framing you as dramatic. If your reason for going no contact is rooted in controlling their behavior rather than reclaiming your own peace, you will likely be disappointed. The silence was never meant to fix them. It was meant to protect you. When someone decides to go no contact, the emotional landscape they step into is far more complicated than they often expect. The silence can feel like relief for a moment, but then the cravings for familiarity begin to surface. The human brain, conditioned to cycles of conflict, reconciliation, and intermittent reinforcement, starts to miss the very chaos it once despised. This is where the backfire begins. Instead of finding peace, the person may feel restless, empty, and even more drawn to the toxic dynamic. Doubt creeps in, and they start questioning their decision, convincing themselves that maybe the relationship wasn't as damaging as it truly was. This is the trap of longing, the distorted memory that paints dysfunction as comfort simply because it is familiar. Another trap lies in identity loss. For many people entangled with toxic partners, their entire sense of worth becomes defined by the role they played: caretaker, fixer, rescuer, or peacemaker. When that role is suddenly stripped away through no contact, they are left asking, who am I without this? That void of identity can feel unbearable. The silence is not just the absence of the other person. It is the absence of a role that once gave a sense of purpose, even if that purpose was unhealthy. In moments of weakness, that void can push them back toward the toxic person, not out of love, but out of fear of being nothing without them. The spiral deepens when overthinking takes hold. Without new coping strategies in place, the mind replays every conversation, every mistake, every moment of tension, searching for meaning. Instead of healing, the silence becomes a breeding ground for self-blame and obsessive thoughts. This is why no contact can feel like a mental prison instead of liberation if the emotional traps are not addressed. Walking away from a toxic dynamic and cutting off contact is only one part of the process, but many people assume it is the entire solution. The truth is, no contact creates a space, and what you fill that space with will determine whether you heal or whether you relapse into the same cycle. If you remove the chaos without replacing it with healthy patterns, the silence can feel unbearable. The brain becomes restless, craving stimulation, and in the absence of new routines, it defaults to the familiar pull of the toxic relationship. That's why no contact alone, without support, so often backfires. It leaves a void that the mind desperately tries to fill. Healing requires active rebuilding. Therapy, journaling, mindfulness practices, and physical movement can give the body and mind outlets to process pain rather than recycle it. Surrounding yourself with supportive people who validate your boundaries can help counteract the loneliness that comes from losing not only the toxic person, but often their social circle as well. Without this support network, isolation becomes a heavy weight, and many give in simply because they cannot bear standing alone. No contact was never meant to be lived in isolation. It was meant to be lived alongside new sources of safety and connection. The other part of healing is building a future identity, creating new goals, rediscovering hobbies, and finding meaning outside of the toxic role you once played shifts your sense of self. You begin to define yourself not by the wounds someone gave you, but by the choices you make to heal. No contact succeeds, not when the silence is maintained mechanically, but when the life you're building becomes more fulfilling than the chaos you left behind. That rebuilding is what transforms a boundary into lasting freedom. The effectiveness of no contact is never measured by the reaction of the toxic person. It is measured by the transformation happening within you. Yet so many people enter this boundary expecting it to change someone else, hoping the silence will trigger regret, accountability, or even a sudden recognition of their worth. That mindset keeps the power outside of you and tied to a person who was never willing to give it freely. The reality is, their reaction does not define the value of your choice. They may ignore you, they may retaliate, they may spread false narratives, or they may try to lure you back. None of that means your boundary was wrong. It only reveals why the boundary was necessary in the first place. No contact is about reclaiming ownership of your peace and stability. It is about finally saying that your mental and emotional well-being no longer hinge on the moods, manipulations, or validations of someone else. When you recognize this, the silence stops being about them and becomes entirely about you. It becomes a statement of self-respect, a declaration that you are no longer available for cycles that diminish you. The focus shifts inward, toward your healing, your growth, and your ability to build a life outside of chaos. The success of no contact also depends on compassion for yourself. There will be moments of weakness, temptations to break it, or nights when the silence feels unbearable. That doesn't mean you've failed. It means you are human. The key is not perfection, but persistence. Each time you choose to stay committed to your boundary, you reinforce your self-worth. And over time, that reinforcement builds strength. The true measure of success is not whether they notice your silence. It is whether you learn to thrive in it. No contact is not a magic switch that erases pain or instantly heals the scars left behind. It is a boundary, and like any boundary, its power lies not in the silence itself, but in how you choose to live within it. When you approach it with misplaced expectations, hoping to punish, to control, or to change the toxic person, it can backfire and leave you even more wounded. When you underestimate the emotional traps, the identity void, or the psychological withdrawal, the silence can feel unbearable. But when you pair no contact with intentional healing, with new routines, with support systems, and with the courage to redefine your life outside of dysfunction, it becomes more than silence. It becomes a statement of self, respect, a pathway to freedom, and a foundation for growth. The real success of no contact is not found in the reaction of the other person, but in the transformation of yourself. It is in your ability to reclaim peace, to rebuild identities, and to choose a future that no longer depends on chaos for meaning. In the end, no contact works not because it changes them, but because it allows you to finally change the way you show up for yourself.